morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in this room or somewhere, people listening in from somewhere in the planet. Welcome to the session, Fair and Equitable REDD Finance and Benefit Sharing Mechanisms for Climate Goals and Justice. My name is Christopher Martius. I'm the director of CIFOR Germany's office, representing CIFOR ICRAF, and as part of the consortium that organized this session today, which also has Oeko-Institut, the Institute for Applied Ecology in Berlin, the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands, and the University of Helsinki in Finland. And we're going to have speakers from all these places. This session is about transparency and accountability in REDD+. We are going to explore challenges and opportunities to make REDD+ more efficient, more effective, and more equitable. And we look back on our own global comparative study on REDD+, 12 years of research in over 22 countries, and also a few other activities from the partners and together with the partners. And so this is a session we're going to listen to science results. We are hearing listen to the science, so we're trying to bring science to you, and when you're here in this room you may be interested in listening to science. I heard today on the telly Boris Johnson saying that this conference was never meant to solve the climate problem in 2 weeks. Maybe that shows a little bit of under-ambitious ideas, but on the other hand, I think when it comes to equity, we also need to be sure we do things right, and we should take the time to make that happen, and that's why we think we need to look at the evidence. From our work on transformational change, we know that transformations are deep changes, but we also want fast changes, we want wide-ranging changes. But there is a trade-off between these three dimensions. If you want to have things quick, they may not be that deep as needed, and if you want to do things sweeping, the same. And so I think we need to take the necessary time. We shouldn't be taking endless time. The climate goals are urgent, but we also should take sufficient time to solve these problems. And so with this, I'd like to, well, first of all, I should say there is another moderator, M.Brockhaus from University of Helsinki. She's online, and we have a few other speakers online, in addition to those here in the room. And Maria will talk later, but she may also come in between as helping me moderate this. I'd like now to introduce our first speaker, who is Anke Herold, sitting here to my next to me, and she's executive director of the Oeko-Institut, which is the Institute for Applied Ecology in Berlin. Anke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christopher. The title of my presentation is Crediting of Land Use Activities, and so it's going to a couple of issues that are not directly about fairness and equity, but we have trying to think it through also from the point of view of fairness and equity. So next slide, please. I can do this on my own, sorry, forgot. So we have been doing a study where we were looking at 16 crediting standards for REDD+ and LULUCF activities, and we were looking at what challenges of land use crediting exist regarding environmental integrity. So that was the main purpose of that study. So we were looking at establishing credible baselines, and at addressing leakage, at addressing non-permanence, at providing adequate, accurate and consistent monitoring, and also at the issue of guaranteeing safeguards and realizing co-benefits. In my presentation, I will only take up two of these issues now, like addressing leakage and addressing non-permanence, and you will also see that at the end I will try to make that link to fairness and equity. So starting with the first topic, non-permanence. This refers to reversals of emissions, reductions or increased removals at a later point in time. Often we have that situation, for example, when it comes to wetland restoration, there the carbon sequestration takes place over a long period of time in the wetlands, but when you reverse the management, for example, when you start drainage again of wetlands, then all this stored carbon can be released rather quickly. This is like the first point on slow in, fast outs. Then we have another issue of non-permanence, that the carbon stocks that we are creating in REDD+ activities, for example in forests, they are also vulnerable to climate change impacts, to fires, to drought, to storms. So, and can then, of course, this can create a problem of non-permanence. And then we can have management changes. A very typical example here is that you have, for a number of years, no tillage or low tillage activities to increase carbon stocks in soils, and then you can shift again to plowing, and then quite some part of this sequestered carbon would be released again. So in these crediting standards that we have been analyzed, they all address this challenge of non-permanence. So it cannot be ensured, but the risks can be mitigated. So there are several ways how to mitigate those risks. The first area is to avoid or reducing the risk of reversals. So sometimes certain projects with very high non-permanence risks are excluded, or the standards establish incentives for activity owners to manage risks. Another area is the accounting or compensation for reversals. So concepts have been developed such as temporary carbon credits, also the compensation for reversals through the use of diversified pooled buffers, and also accounting approaches have been used in that area in many standards. Then the third area would be to address non-permanence in an appropriate activities design, where it would be the responsibility of project owners to monitor and compensate for the reversals over a long time horizons. But when you now look at what is a fair and equitable risk sharing, then I think these approaches look differently. For example, in the last one, the activity design, then a large responsibility would be bared by the project owners. Whereas, for example, when you look at the accounting and compensation approaches, then you have more or less the same treatment across all activities in the same way, and it can be applied in a rather similar way across the board, whereas the other approaches are would look different for different activities. Coming to the second point of leakage. Leakage refers to a net increase in greenhouse gas emissions outside the project area with direct or indirect leakage to the activity. Direct leakage is, for example, when you avoid deforestation in one area and then the driving force for that deforestation is moved to another area. Indirect leakage is when, for example, when you reduce cattle numbers in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those cattle, and then you just get more imports of meat from other countries. So that would be through the market effects, this indirect leakage. So also the crediting standards address the challenge of leakage. In general, when we would have full coverage of land uses in national targets and national NDCs, and an effective and monitoring and a robust accounting across all countries, that would very strongly reduce the leakage problem. but it would still be necessary to avoid leakage to the extent possible through a careful design of activities. For example, through the implementation on abandoned land, through the introduction of buffer zones. Also, is necessary to quantify leakage appropriately using case-specific quantification methods that captures the specific situation better than default factors, which are sometimes used in those standards. And it would also be important to include leakage transparently in the accounting. When you now also look at those options in relation to whether the responsibility is attributed in a fair way, then there are some concepts in our view. For example, when the standards use a buffer zones around the project area, then such a buffer zone would address like maybe small stakeholder activities in that buffer zone, but and then would take into account of that. But when you would have a driving force that is more like coming from big agricultural companies that can choose to place their activities in different parts of the countries, those would not be captured in the same way in this concept of buffer zones. So from this point of view, we think that these concepts on environmental integrity, we need to think them through in a better way, also looking at these aspects of fairness and equity and whether we do address all stakeholders in the same way or in a different way. Then in general, when you look at how we can improve fair and equitable REDD+ finance, in particular in relation to these standards, we think they need to become more inclusive. So they treat participation in different ways, but very often we have a lack of funding for participation, in particular for developing countries in the standard development. And so you have an approach where everybody is invited to comment on methodologies and on concepts, but you need to have the experts available that can really do that work. And the question is whether there are experts who get really some funding to participate in that work in developing countries. So there we have a clear issue of fairness and equity in our view. And it's still a big question how a fully inclusive standard development process should be designed and would look like. Then the second area we wanted to raise in this short presentation here is the capacity for and the access to crediting. So standards require a lot of detailed data and information structure for crediting, and those are not present in all the countries. So there is an unequal representation of project activities across countries, in particular across those that lack data and infrastructure. And it's a need to increase capacities, in particular in those countries, so that they can better participate. But we also need to better integrate global open source data so that it is available for more developing countries and that we have more of such open source data financed so that it is accessible to many more parties than it currently is. And we are running another project on forest monitoring that is trying to get more of those open source data available at global level. So I would like to finalize with those observations. Like a lot of the standards have been looking at how environmental integrity can be ensured. That was a big focus on all the standards that we analyzed. But fair and equitable REDD+ finance requires more than that. It requires an inclusive standard development and also capacities in developing countries for and access to crediting. And these concepts, for example, how we implement environmental integrity, we have not really thought that through, how the approaches look like from the point of view of fairness and equity. And there is still quite a challenge to provide a level playing field to all countries, and our thinking is not yet completed in this area, and there is still quite some work to do. So I just wanted to point at the end at this study where we have been looking at these 16 different standards, and then I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anke, for a good introduction to our subject. I should have said before, we are going, have been transparent myself about this session. We're going to have 3 presentations, one by Anke in the room, 2 by speakers offline, or online, sorry, but not off the grounds. And then we are going to have 3 comments, 2 by the speakers to my left and 1 by somebody coming online. So I'd like to invite immediately the next speaker who we have pre-recorded, and I should introduce him. It's Professor Blaise Pascal Ntirumenyerwa-Mihigo from the University of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he's Associate Professor of International Environmental Law. And please, let's hear from Professor Blaise Pascal. This is online and recorded.
Distinguished attendees and organizer, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to discuss with you on an interesting topic related to fair and equitable finance and benefit sharing for climate goals and justice, the case of Democratic Republic of Congo. This presentation was prepared by me, Professor M.Brockhaus, and Professor Grace Wong as our contribution to the side event of CIFOR in this COP26. The outline of our presentation has 4 main parts. Firstly, I will provide a brief overview on the legal and policy framework on forest finance, climate change, development, and sustainability. Then I will focus on the content of the NDC and the implementation of REDD+ in Congo. Next, I will describe the link between finance, equity, and ambition in the case of Congo. Finally, I will provide selected elements to consider for ensuring equity in REDD and forest finance. There is an abundant number of agreements and soft law universally adopted on climate change, forest, and development. The UNFCCC Convention, the Paris Agreement, the Agenda 2030 on SDGs are some examples. At the domestic level, the Congo has adopted a climate change regulation. The Congo is revising its forest code and has signed 2 letters of intent. The last has been signed here in this COP26 between the President of Democratic Republic of Congo and the Prime Minister of UK. Also, the DRC is revising the law on agriculture and is implementing foreign agricultural investment policy to develop the country. In addition, Congo has elaborated and implemented some development policies, such as the National Strategic Plan for the Development. What about the content of the NDC and the implementation of REDD in Congo? The DRC has submitted 2 NDC, the first in 2017 and the second in 2021, during this COP26. The second NDC is more ambitious than the first NDC. The second NDC promotes the reduction of 21% of greenhouse gas emission, 4% more than the first NDCs. The second NDCs integrate waste as a sector of reducing emission, which was not included in the first NDC. The second NDC estimates the financial needs to 48 billions, which represents 25 billions more than the first NDC. REDD+ in DR Congo focuses on 7K sectors like land use planning, tenure, forests, and 18 REDD+ programs. Challenges has been have been identified on energy, mining, and forest sectors. One of the latest reports on the implementation of REDD+ in DRC, under the first letter of intent signed between COFI and DRC from 2010 to 2020, reveals success and failure of REDD+ in DRC. For significant progress in land use planning, tenure, 6 little progress in agricultural policy, and 3 no progress on improved cook stoves, stabilizing illegal logging, and drafting REDD+ regulation related to mining and oil have been identified. Regarding this progress, one can question what they entail, who benefit from this progress, how finances, equity, and ambition are linked in the context of REDD+ in DRC. As mentioned before, the DRC has submitted 2 NDC in which its ambition is described. To stabilize deforestation, one of the biggest issues is the moratorium, which shortly means the interdiction to deliver forests concession title during a period. Since 2005, the DRC applies this moratorium, but not successfully, as some forests concessions have been illegally delivered. Recently, in October 2021, the President of DRC requested the Vice Prime Minister on Environment and Sustainable Development to examine all the forest concession titles in Congo. Among 157 titles assessed, 87 are convertible, 57 converted to forest concession, 16 was returned to the state, 5 converted to concession of conservation, and 3 suspended. Forest concession exploitation and the respect or not of the moratorium implies domestic and global inequality. These raise questions on who profit from this, what this means for local population and for the competition for land. This could be analyzed on 3 layers regarding equity: distributional, procedural, and recognition and contextual aspects of equity. With all this information, we could ask the question, how to ensure equity in REDD+ and forest finance for DRC? Reflection on shifting incentive for standing forests and on shifting mindset are needed. Regarding incentive, it's important to analyze the risk of misleading public and private finance for business as usual exploitation followed by tree planting. Concerning mindset, it's necessary to question if forest cover is not necessarily driven by population growth or displacement and land scarcity through old and new concession. It's also needful to understand the implication of the promised millions of this COP26 and how forest finance will ensure climate goals, equity, and just outcomes. Many thanks for your attention and your possible constructive question.
Thank you very much for this introduction to the problems in DRC and setting us up for discussion of this, and also thanks for pointing out the different dimensions of equity, procedural, distributional, and recognition or participation. With this, I'd like to move directly to the next speaker, which is my colleague, S.Atmadja. She's a scientist at CIFOR, and she will talk about REDD finance.
Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm S.Atmadja, scientist at CIFOR. With my colleague Pam Tutui, we'd like to present some preliminary findings on research that we and our research partners conducted on REDD finance. In particular, we asked the question, who controls the flow of finance for REDD? Who benefits? How can we make it more effective? and more accessible. There are many ways to finance REDD action. In this presentation, we focus on two ways, through the international aid flow on the left, which we'll call the REDD aid, and through the voluntary carbon markets on the right, which we'll call the REDD markets. In REDD aid, financing typically flows from donor to recipient geography or country through a funding channel. In the REDD market, demand and supply for carbon credits meet. The demand comes from private organizations voluntarily seeking to offset their emissions. Supply comes from REDD projects. The carbon certification standards serve as a guardian to the market, and it ensures as much as it can that credits are credible. Let's first start with REDD aid. We use data from OECD creditor reporting system, which tracks official development assistance flows, and focus on the last 10 years of the available data, which is 2010 to 2019. We tagged two kinds of REDD aid: direct REDD aid, which is what we call for funding that is described using keywords closely associated with REDD, like REDD+, or reducing emissions from deforestation. The other kind is called indirect REDD, funding activities that have the same objectives but not using the same words. In the 10 years, there was a total of almost $33.4 billion that was tagged for both kinds of REDD+. $5.6 billion was for the direct REDD+, and half of that came from Norway. In contrast, the funding source for indirect REDD+ is more diverse, as you can see in the pie charts. The financing burden is shared more widely, more evenly. The next question is, who channels these funds? Those who channel REDD aid set the procedures and underlying norms for how funds are used and distributed, such as safeguards, benefit sharing, and MRV. In the case of direct REDD, 3 institutions set the financial procedures for almost half of the direct REDD aid funding: World Bank Group, UNDP, and the Brazilian Development Bank. They will have substantial influence over how others will channel the same funds. Multilaterals, which are the blue part in this figure, channel proportionally more direct REDD funding than public sector, NGOs, and other types of institutions. This is not the case in indirect REDD, where the public sector plays a more important role. This makes us wonder, why is this happening in the direct REDD aid? Is there a perceived lack of capacity and financial enforced governance in the countries particularly receiving REDD aid? Is relying on a small group of channel institutions a way of being more cost efficient? And how would countries perceive this setup? Are there higher expectations of accountability being exercised by the few donor countries that contribute most to the funding flow? Where does this REDD aid go? Slightly less than half of the direct REDD aid, or about $2.9 billion are targeted to specific countries here. The rest goes to regions or were not geographically specific. A large part of this goes to Brazil. It makes sense due to the country's vast forest resources, yet in general, to us, the choice of countries and the proportion committed across these countries seem more of a social, political, or economical rather than a technical choice. Given the relatively limited resources, direct REDD is investing heavily in a few select countries. This makes sense to avoid spreading the funds too thinly, but it's quite risky since it puts a lot of eggs in one country basket. In contrast, a larger proportion of indirect REDD is going to specific countries. With more funds, there are more countries receiving this aid. Large portions more or less go to countries having large potential for natural climate solutions. If we look at the proportions, there are no big differences across countries, unlike the one we've seen in direct REDD. What I explained above puts 10 years into one narrative, when in fact, REDD aid has been evolving. Between 2010 and 2017, the ratio of indirect versus direct REDD aid is pretty much constant. But in the last 2 years of this data, 2018 and 2019, it has shot up, as indicated by this gray line, which means that indirect REDD aid has been increasing and direct REDD aid has been decreasing. The total amount has increased overall, which means there's increased interest in REDD as an objective, but the words that people are using are now shifting away from the old words that were used to explain direct REDD. So let's now switch to the REDD market. The data on REDD markets is fragmented across different carbon registries, different websites, carbon standards. Price data is generally not provided to the public, only the volume. So we can't really put a price on how big is the flow of finance through these markets. Using the IDRECO database, we could identify 377 ongoing REDD projects between 2018 and 2020, covering 53 million hectares in 56 countries. The establishment of new REDD projects peaked in 2011, but declined since then. Yet surveys by Ecosystem Marketplace, for example, finds a strong uptick of private sector interest with an explosion of finance in 2021. So what's going on? So once we can reap the benefits of this extravaganza, those who are still there to benefit from it, a lot of the survival depends on accessing finance from the voluntary carbon market. We found that many projects face 5 to 10 years between the project start and the first transaction in the carbon market. Projects could rely on project grants, such as those financed through the REDD aid flow. There hasn't been a lot of options to help them weather this period. Entry into the market requires a lot of enabling conditions, many of which are beyond the control of project proponents and other local actors, such as legal and institutional frameworks for carbon rights, clear land tenure, and access to affordable technical expertise and MRV data needed to estimate and monitor emission reductions. Sustained survival of projects depend on support and guidance from local communities too, and local governments. This support can happen if there's clear benefits, but given all these risks, it's a tough market, and so projects are left promising either too much or too little. I'd like to conclude with some thoughts on moving forward to a more effective and accessible REDD finance. Multilaterals play a very important role in REDD aid thus far, but needs to evolve with the rest of REDD aid and consider devolving some of the responsibilities to public institutions in recipient countries, of course, on a case-by-case basis. REDD aid funding sources and recipients need to be spread more widely to reduce risks and burdens on particular countries. With this in mind, private sector contributions are a way to share the financial burden, but that needs to become much more transparent than it is now. Enabling conditions to support market-based finance for REDD would help improve accessibility to wider diversity of actors. The REDD aid and market funding flows are indeed complementary, but they are linked so poorly that it's not, we need to better understand it so that we can identify financial gaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Nia, for dissecting the REDD plus finance for us with recent data. These were our three presentations. I'd like now to get to our three commenters, and I'd like to start with Milagros Sandoval-Diaz from the Ministry of Environment in Peru. Milagros, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's definitely very interesting to see, to have seen the presentations and also all these issues that need a lot of reflection and that can make us understand where the overall process is. Maybe some reflections related to the work that we're doing in Peru and the work that and related to some of the issues that have been highlighted in the presentations. First, I would like to highlight that in Peru we also, as the colleague from DRC mentioned, we also have a legal framework that is that was enacted in 2018. It's the climate change law, and its regulation was enacted in 2019. These regulations start to establish clearly the role of the Ministry of Environment, but also the role of other sectors in this process. Because definitely climate change is an issue that needs to be promoted by different sectors, but also by the subnational governments, civil society, indigenous peoples, among others, that are relevant stakeholders in the country. So definitely that is something that has set a first step towards giving clarity over and legal security over the process that we are envisioning as a country. Specifically in the regulations related to the climate change law, there are specific mandates related to REDD+ and how we can engage in this process and continue giving this legal clarity over the overall process. Mainly, there are specific regulations that we are calling them a REDD+ package, in which we have identified different specific regulations that have to be enacted and obviously have to be done through a participatory process. One of the regulations that has already been enacted is in last July, which we have identified what are the REDD+ actions, or what are the actions that will help us support or address drivers of deforestation, and that are already identified as part of our REDD+ strategy. So it's trying to link all the different elements of REDD+, and especially the Warsaw REDD+ framework, how it can be implemented in the country. Also, I would like to highlight that one of the specific regulations that has been included in the climate change law and its regulations is related to a benefit sharing mechanism. This benefit sharing mechanisms, this is a work in progress, this specific regulation, but I would like to highlight 3 or 4 main points about it and what we're working related on this. First, that it tries to bring in lessons learned from different initiatives, different projects that have already been working on the ground. That is definitely important because it helps us understand what are the lessons learned, what has worked, what hasn't worked in the country. Definitely because our country is very diverse. It has different national, subnational circumstances that have to be addressed when discussing these issues. Another thing that I would like to highlight also is related to a participatory process that it will include the engagement, especially of indigenous peoples. So we have to work on a specific intercultural dialogue in order to address their priorities, the needs of indigenous peoples, and this will be done through our Indigenous Peoples Platform that was enacted last year and that was created last year as part also of our climate change law regulation, which addresses the need to discuss climate change issues with the 7 national federations that represent the diversity of indigenous peoples that we have in Peru. So definitely that is important, and I would like to highlight that this participatory process are the basis for all of these regulations. No regulations can be enacted without a participatory process, and especially in the case of indigenous peoples issues, we go through the Indigenous Peoples Platform. Also, I would just like to highlight a third point I would like to emphasize is related to the safeguards and how this will be included in the process. We are currently working on our safeguard information system, which includes also a grievance mechanism that will hopefully be enacted by the end of this year. This has been done with support of different stakeholders as well, and this will also bring and link this overall process to REDD+ and give clarity over the process. We are also working, and this will be included and linked to National Registry for Mitigation Actions, which obviously will include other sectors, but definitely this is somehow I wanted to highlight some of the different elements that we have in the country in order to link all this process in overall, and how we see forest issues as a main process in the country, considering the diversity and the importance of the Amazon in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Milagros, for showing us how the benefit sharing mechanism is development is work in progress in Peru, and particularly it's a participatory and interactive process, learning-oriented process. Thanks very much. We're going to have another intervention from Peru in a minute, but now I'd like to ask first a comment coming from online from Michael Hüttner, who is an advisor to the GIZ.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. I hope you can hear me and see me possibly.
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for the very interesting presentations. Listening to the presentations, I think what is important, first of all, is having discussed among benefit sharing aspects and also equity aspects for quite a while in REDD, we should find a pragmatic approach where we move ahead with the imperfect, because we will always have the imperfect. There will not be a perfect REDD system. But while stressing that we should get started in the implementation, I think it's important to also stress that while working with the imperfect, we also have to build in mechanisms that allow for iterative improvements along the way. And we can compare to other systems of governance. For example, a tax system in a country is always imperfect, and you always have these loopholes where you have tax evaders. But still, the tax system is useful to be implemented and to be iteratively improved. So I think the same is true for REDD, and specifically for aspects like benefit sharing that will be imperfect from the start and will need improvement. So how can we feed up bottom in learning into that system? I think that's important, and it brings me to my second point, that we need some pragmatic transparency through an accountability framework that's robust, that will allow also for not only for participation from the different stakeholder groups, but we also heard today, but also allow for conflict resolution, and will be also aligned with national law enforcement and governance. A lot of laws are existing there, but the enforcement and the governance are two aspects that still need improvement. And to be clear, I think that's nothing that REDD can solve alone, and I think this has been one of the weak points in the past, that there were a lot of overburdening of expectations from REDD that it will solve all the governance and land use and transparency issues that we currently face and lack. And therefore, I think REDD needs to be integrated in a wider programmatic approach, specifically on land use and rural development, where you have agriculture, forestry, and conservation being considered together, and where carbon is one of the metrics among many others. And here we see some good programmatic approaches already on the way in some of the countries. We also see some of these approaches in the collaboration, the joint declarations of intent, for example, with Peru and Colombia, but they are, let me put it mildly, a first step, so they would need to be much wider, not only to be considered this is a pet project of the Ministry of Environment, or this is a pet project of the donors, but really this becomes an integrative strategy of the country at hand, with all the different ministries involved and being involved from the start. So my third point is that in order to ensure fair, equitable benefit sharing, we also need to think about the liability, because when we look at the private sector, and it was mentioned before from Nia in the presentation, that we have these private sector projects increasing, but at the same time they work with a different type of liability from private actors. When we now look at new initiatives like the LEAF initiative, they're working with jurisdictions or states, and there the liability specifically what you do, what can you do when you have leakage, what can you do when you have non-permanence, is a totally different question, and that needs to be answered, and it remains to be seen how this can be resolved sufficiently. So here also I think a lot of innovation would be needed. Can we work with investment securities? Can we work with insurance systems, etc.? Can we work with a different form of legal liability that still needs to be evolved, etc.? And linked to that is also one element that still needs to be explored further, in my view, and that's carbon rights, because even the very pragmatic approaches that we see out there, the standards, etc., the initiatives, often cannot really give a good answer to the question of the carbon rights and how they are linked to the land rights. And to my knowledge, also this still needs to be defined in a lot of countries at stake. And so last but not least, I'd like to stress that the standards that we're seeing, a lot of them still lack sufficient implementation, specifically when we come to a jurisdiction or national level. So the standards alone will not suffice to resolve the issues at hand for fair and equitable benefit sharing. It needs more. It also needs the systems in the countries to actually implement the standards that we're talking about. So talking, for example, about Sociobosque in Ecuador, that's a program that really has an established institutional system of benefit sharing that the standards alone cannot guarantee. So that is something that the standards need to, or better, let's say the countries or the programs implementing the standards need to keep in mind when talking about fair and equitable benefit sharing. And last but not least, linking private and public capital. I think that's one of the key issues to be also considered by donors in the future and also by forest countries in the future, how to do that in the most effective way. And I think here, the indirect REDD financing that also has been mentioned in the presentation will also increase in its importance, because here we are talking about collaboration on long-term enabling framework conditions that are not necessarily in the scope nor in the capacity of private sector actors to change that. So this is something where we see the public sector actually in a role to de-risking the framework conditions, and this is something that could be beneficial for the whole REDD community, because we see that the private sector can engage under framework conditions that have been improved by joint programmatic approaches from the public sector, both developing and developed countries. So this is my take on this discussion, and I'm looking forward to further exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your contribution. We're moving now to L.Schneider, who is representing Conservation International Peru. Claudio, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me in this event and for the very illustrating presentations and comments. Just to follow up on what has previously been said, I think REDD Plus continues to be a very complex topic of discussion. I think because of this complexity, there's much to be done in terms of bringing the different stakeholders together. To me, effective participation is sitting everybody at the table that needs to be seated in order for REDD Plus to move forward. We have been working for about 12 years in Peru, together with the government, together with communities, and together with the private sector as well. If we don't sit at the table and explain to each other and talk frankly to each other on, how REDD Plus can really address our needs, our values, we're not going to move forward. I think every one of us has an important role to play. My colleague Milagros mentioned the efforts that the government of Peru is making to create an enabling environment for REDD Plus to be developed in Peru. We need to create that environment of trust. We need to create an environment where indigenous communities, for example, or the beneficiaries of REDD Plus are at the forefront of the discussions. But we also need to create an environment where the private sector feels certainty or has the certainty to invest in REDD Plus. And of course, we need to create an environment where the government is able to meet its commitments to the UNFCCC and other commitments as well. I think that the efforts that are being made by the Peruvian government are in the right direction. They are developing what is called a nested approach to REDD, and using the experience of many years of REDD projects on the ground to complement the national efforts that the country has. This is, of course, not easy. It's very, very complex. It takes a lot of technical issues that need to be resolved, but it also takes, more importantly, a lot of political will and commitment from all the different stakeholders to participate in the process. I believe that fair and equitable REDD Plus, it's a REDD Plus that will be able to achieve transformation. REDD Plus, in theory, is not forever. If REDD Plus succeeds, we're not going to need it anymore, but we need to use REDD Plus in those years to create this change, this development that is required on the ground with the communities and generate, you know, the economic opportunities and a way of development that leads to the conservation of forests too. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, Claudia, thank you very much. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to all speakers and commenters so far. With this, we are now opening our question and answer session. I hope you have many. If you do, we have 4 microphones in the room in the corners here, and if you have a question, please raise your hand, get to a microphone, take off your mask. We may also have comments coming online from the audience. Please write us comments, and we'll try to accommodate them. Yes, and lights on.
And Christopher?
Yes, and Maria?
Yes, let me just jump in here a little bit from the off. I'm Maria Brockhaus. My name is Maria Brockhaus. I'm Professor of International Forest Policy, and I'm delighted to be co-moderator of this event. So I just used this opportunity to quickly say hello. But I also wanted to say thank you, while I hope some people in the audience are moving now to their microphones. I just wanted to say really thank you very much for these super interesting presentations and commentaries that you provided. Because actually what we did, I think we made a bit of a journey here where we learned really about standards and the many risks involved in standard setting, together with an idea of where finance is actually going, even though, of course, I would challenge Nia, I would challenge your work a little bit and say maybe the question is not only to whom it is going, but also linking this back to environmental integrity. For what is finance used these days? So is REDD perhaps also shifting from avoiding emissions, from actually this idea of avoiding emissions to compensating, which is much, as we all know, much lower in the emissions reduction or mitigation hierarchy. And then we had DRC, and also with the commentaries from Peru, really interesting insights in what is going on in the countries and how these conflict also with maybe new development ideas or new ideas, new alternative finance. And one comment, and that would be a challenge I will have for Michael if we have later time, Michael Hüttner, is do we really need to protect the investors, or should we start our reflections maybe to protect those that need their forests standing and not perhaps replaced by yet another tree plantation, but really how do we protect those about whose lands we are talking here. So, but the floor is back to you. I just wanted to warn Michael and also Anke and others a little bit that I might come back with more discussion, but I'm sure you have by the time now more interesting questions also from the room.
Thank you, Maria, for your comments. Anybody in the room now would like to say something? We have a hand up in the back. Would you please go to the microphone?
Rod Harbinson, journalist. I do a lot of investigative journalism with indigenous people in Southeast Asia. I just wonder, a lot of those are getting their lands stolen basically by the government. because they don't have gazetted land rights, and it's oral land rights, and they pretty much are in a conflict situation. So in terms of financing, I wonder what thoughts you might have on financing channels going to corrupt governments and how to avoid that, because, you know, as I think we all appreciate, the money is really required on the ground by people who are actually working with forests. So to me, I think there are various different linkages and levels that need to be looked at in detail on the national and regional levels to avoid these sorts of problems. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is how to avoid money going to corrupt governments. Let's collect 2 or 3 questions. We had somebody in the back, sorry, and then the gentleman in the front. Did you raise your hand in the back? No. Okay, please go ahead. Please find a... Oh, here's standing somebody. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, you go first. Thank you. And then the gentleman here.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer Holm. I'm a climate scientist from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and this is wonderful. I work mostly on modeling how forests can be carbon sinks or sources in the future. So I guess I was wondering a little bit maybe with the first presentation, like how can we now as in the modeling community go a step further than where we are past the IPCC, but really kind of really help all these efforts with REDD, maybe specifically things with improved modeling of baselines or linkages or the non-permanence issues. And I can't even wrap my head around maybe how we can help with more equity with financing, but at least we could kind of help with some of these leakage issues a little bit more. I don't know. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And please.
Thank you so much. I'm Kaganga John, and I'm also working in environment management. I'm also a smallholder farmer from Uganda. I'm just raising a concern, and I'm so happy that as far as the research, the work has been good. But since REDD came into existence, it has been business as usual. And whatever come on board is to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind and to help people at the grassroots. But as far as we are concerned, people at the grassroots, I can assure you, REDD Plus has not been felt. And it is not really working as it is intended. Therefore, if we continue to talk to REDD Plus as usual, I think we will be missing a point. Therefore, I am advising that the system, the policies and so forth should be at least needed to be revised so that if the money which is given, or if it is carbon, the market, REDD plus market, should also be clear, but it is not even clear, and it is not well understood.
Thank you. So basically, your concern is how is the money coming down to the grassroots level? Thank you very much for this. And we have a 4th question, and then we go to the answers, perhaps.
My question is there any global mechanism?
Could you introduce yourself, please, quickly?
I will later.
Okay.
Is there any global mechanism that directly help the local community to be able to access to the carbon market? Because I'm Mr. Win from Myanmar, so we have been helping the local community to establish community forestry in my country. So we were contacted last 2 years ago, there's some German company or some company from Switzerland, but they want to buy some be certifying carbon from those forests community established. Then we are stuck because for certification, even there's a volunteer market. It's too complicated and too costly, and then we can't do that. Okay, even though there's a buyer, there is no such a mechanism, we cannot find. So I simply want to know that when we talk about now Article 6 or whatever, are there any considerations, some sort of global entity that may help for this kind of technical barrier that community are facing? Also, what I'm finding also the costly, because the buyer from Europe is asking them whether we can meet the gold standard or something like that. Okay, so it's too complicated. Even consulting company come and they are asking the money that we are not we cannot pay. So without solving this kind of practical problem, I think the equitable access still remain question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So basically, the local mechanism, how to make certification less complicated, less costly for local actors. Okay, we have 4 questions. Who wants to go with answers? Anke, perhaps? Would you like to start?
Yeah, starting with the question on how we are dealing with corrupt governments. Well, I think the financing activities do not need to go always to the governments. You can also work with regions. You can work with other stakeholders, like with indigenous people stakeholders, with NGOs networks. We are trying to do this in a couple of countries with my own organization, but I must admit that these activities are really, really difficult to implement. So most of the countries, and my own country, Germany, is pledging a lot of money to REDD+ activities, but when you look at how these projects are constructed, they want to have like large projects in single countries where a lot of money is going to like single countries' governments, and like those project activities that are financed when you try to work with NGOs in countries or with indigenous people stakeholders, they are like rather small, or they have such a large number of conditions linked to them that you're almost never able to really implement all those conditions at the same time, trying to work with a number of organizations. And like on the administrative part, that becomes really difficult. So we are trying to develop these type of activities that somehow like bypass corrupt governments and work with credible stakeholders in these countries. But the way the finance mechanisms are set up, like at the multilateral or at the country level, it's not very easy to do this, and it requires a lot of efforts when you try to channel finance to these other type of stakeholders in the REDD countries. And I think governments should become much more aware of this and try to find solutions how we can work better together. And like my own institute, we are really trying only to bring people together and to get that project up and running, and then they have the responsibilities, and we step back once that has been achieved. But it's really difficult to get these other type of activities up and running. And that is, I think, something that we should also address governments in trying to change. Then on the second question, with regard to all the issues, the technical issues that we have been addressing, I think there are now a lot of concepts in place that we have elaborated from a scientific point of view and that can get implemented. And on that side, I think we have done an incredible amount of scientific work, which helps now the projects to get implemented. But we have not really considered these fairness and equity issues sufficiently also in relation to this work on environmental integrity. And I think there we really need to get further work done, and that we, from a scientific point of view, also try to have this more in our minds when we work on those principles.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, bundling finance is good for the donor countries. It's maybe not so good for the recipients, because then, as we have seen in Nia's presentation, money goes to a few places only. Nia, you have your hand up, so maybe you want to comment first, and then Michael.
Yes. Hi, Chris. Thanks. So I think there's always this tension between avoiding corruption. So corruption in finance, corruption in calculating how much emissions are being really reduced, and having standards that can ensure that the funds go to places that need it in a way that's most effective. And so on one hand, we make standards more rigorous, but then it's less accessible. And then on the other hand, if it's more accessible, maybe we need to make standards more flexible, more locally relevant. So I think the reason why there's this tension is because, like what Anke and Hannes were presenting, is that the standards may not have been developed in a way that's collaborative. And also the flows that I mentioned are not linked together. And so, for example, the flow of aid is very state-oriented, one state to another state. And there's a lot of NGOs and community level actors that get it in the end, trickle-down process, but it's a very state-based process. And then the market mechanism is another, where it's not really state-based, but it's more limited by the technical access, the cost of proving that your project is worthy of this kind of flow. And so I think if that's why I was suggesting that these two flows need to be better connected, and so that there's more funding going to different levels in a more efficient and how do you say, more distributive way. Thanks.
Thank you, Nia. Michael, floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll add to that, and I think it relates back to the question on the corrupt governments, how to avoid that. I think there are several elements here. First of all, earmarking of funds. So we move away from a purist view of results-based finance that some hold to say, results-based finance is just paying for certain results, and whatever countries or governments are doing with it is not our business. I think these opinions are rather in the minority. So we are talking about earmarking of funding specifically to ensure the trickling down to local communities. An example, REDD Early Movers has a system where 80% needs to go to local indigenous communities of the funding received. And so this requires something which I would call like a financial intermediary, something that is not always in place right now, even for countries that have been quite advanced on REDD+. When they now move to a state-based or a jurisdictional-based REDD+, do these financial intermediaries really work? So this is a question I think that needs to be also tackled carefully by NGOs that try to assess whether these standards work, or let's say whether REDD+ works, because these financial intermediaries will be important to channel money from state-based systems where the government really receives the money to the local community, and that requires also checks and balances and some transparency, and also transparent benefit sharing plans, so that actually these financial intermediaries can report on this accountability, and then the non-governmental sector can check if this is really happening. So this is something that we need. And in answering, going back to what Nia has said, I think here the public and the private sector have two different roles to play. The private sector itself can, of course, try to ensure that benefit sharing and safeguards are implemented within their project area. But now the whole move of REDD+ is moving to the jurisdictional and national level. So this means that projects need to be sufficiently nested into these systems, yet they need sufficient investment security in order to know that they can maintain the effectiveness of their projects, even if, let's say, a country moves into a situation where they have increased emissions. So if a project actually delivers, they shouldn't be punished for that if a country does not deliver. And so this is also partly maybe my answer to Maria's question. I know that it was very tricky, but I think, yes, there's a certain responsibility that the public sector creates the enabling conditions that will minimize the risk for the private sector. But at the same time, the private sector, specifically when they are working in implementation, have a responsibility to ensure that certain safeguards are implemented. So it's not about cutting down the original forest and setting up a carbon plantation, but really to work alongside the ambitious safeguards and also benefit sharing plans that have been set up. So this is to the standard, but the implementation of the standard and the assessment, so to say, of the standard, this is something that goes beyond the responsibility of a single project, but this really then goes back to a national or a jurisdictional system.
Thank you, Michael. Professor Blaise Pascal, do you have any comments to make? In 2 minutes, we are almost closing. No? What about you, Claudio?
Yeah, I would like to complement what Michael said, that in the end, I think the beneficiaries are the most important part of the puzzle. Without ensuring the rights of the beneficiaries, REDD+ is not going to succeed. So a rights-based approach to REDD is key, ensuring that their needs are addressed and then they are properly benefited from REDD is key. And we need the government to create the environment for this to happen, right? The regulations, the legislation needs to be in place, and of course for the private sector to comply with these regulations and to adhere to the highest standards to do that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Blaise Pascal got information. He is not online anymore, so we lost him somehow. Yeah, I think this is a good comment because also maybe a counterpoint to the comment made about governance being corrupt. Governance can be corrupt, but governments also have a role to play, and I think we need to balance this out. And also, it struck me a little bit today, maybe the basic dilemma is sort of, you have standards, you can be very normative, but when Anke talked about leakage, you also introduced the possibility to actually map leakage out and then do something about it. And maybe, in a way, we have the same in safeguards. We have a safeguard information system. It's not perfect, it's not giving us everything we need, but at least it's a start to map out what is there, and then once you know, you can do something about it. And so being very normative without having the right sanctioning mechanisms in place, rights, is I think very important, but then you also need to have the proper redress mechanisms. I think we have a lot to do in terms of design still, and again, learning from experience is key, and so that's what I hope we could bring to you today. Is there any comments from online? Maria, you want to maybe say something? You have 59 seconds.
Thank you so much. 59 seconds. I have to say, I did learn at least a lot, and I think what this session today also helped us. Also, a comment we didn't come back to, comments about the stolen lands, I think was brought up, but also the modeling comment, how to connect to the modeling community. I think in terms of research agenda, we still have a lot of homework to do, which one could argue 12 years in this research in kind of monitoring and assessing REDD+ as a live policy experiment But REDD+ is evolving, and I think we are cut off now, I'm afraid. But what my key point perhaps is a little bit from the presentations that I saw today. I think there is a lot of work to do to protect the D, the avoiding deforestation in REDD+ part. And there are endless tensions, and I think these tensions are very much between private and public sector interests, and the interests of those about whose lands we are talking, something I said before. And that is where, for me, the major question of equity is also laying. What I have seen over the COP, because we are now in the final stages of the COP as well, what I have seen here is really a lot of shift within the forest domain to more and more, and that is perhaps why I keep coming back to tree plantations, really more commitments, more private finance for an easy to measure tree plantation in the location XYZ. But I think what today also showed is that we have to learn that environmental integrity is not only procedures when it comes to these standards, but also the quality of the emissions reduction or the avoided emissions or the compensation that then is awarded or enabled through the standard. And I think paying attention to that, pulling out these tensions between public-private finance. One of the keywords I have here on my paper is accountability, that was repeatedly put forward by speakers. But who is holding whom accountable? What kind of institutional structures are there? And I thought that came nicely out also out of Claudio's comment, but how to enable that there is indeed quality in what is credited in the land use sector. I'm stopping here because I'm going over my 60 seconds, but thank you so much for telling us, sharing with us your experiences and your knowledge.
Thanks, Maria, and I leave it at that for concluding remarks. I'd like to thank everybody, all the speakers and commenters, thanks a lot, also those online, the audience in the room, thanks for being here with us, and the audience online, thanks for being here with us too. And with this, this session is concluded. Thank you very much.